Well, friends, as they say in churches all over the world, good morning. Thanks for the invitation to be part of the conversation that's an ongoing conversation that you've been working at, and I am pleased to be here. Is this not coming through?
Hold it up.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, it is.
All right. I'm still happy to be here. And we have an evening. I know that you all have traveled. I know you've had a meal. Andy's already said it's hard to kind of stay awake in these kinds of settings. What I hope to do is just offer a little bit of an introduction to some of the ways that I think about leadership and why the issue around metrics is as critical as it is. But as Andy said, you've just traveled, you've had your meeting, you've had your meal. So if I'm talking and you hear a cup of coffee calling, I'm going to invite you to pay attention to the coffee. Because when you gather for these kinds of meetings, it's hard work to stay in conversation. It's hard work to think constantly. So I really encourage you to take care of yourself, not only tonight, but also tomorrow while we're working together as well. I've often told groups that my wife and I have raised two boys through their adolescent years, and I'm really comfortable talking to people who are walking away from me. And so it's not going to be an issue. I am, frankly, encouraged and impressed with the program that the Foundation is offering here. One of the things that has been a very clear notion for me, probably within the last 7 to 10 years, is that the day of the expert is over. No one can really stand up here and tell you how you should be leading your church or what you should be doing. Ministry, among other things, is terribly contextual. And at the same time, there are challenges here that you might share in general, but not in particular. And so nobody has the wisdom to be able to tell you this is how you should do it and this is what you could do. And so one of the things we've been watching pretty much, across, not actually all professional development, is the movement away from what is known as horizontal learning, where you get somebody to come and talk to you as if information is here to be distributed out there, and rather that learning happens vertically. It's when you drill down into your own practice. It's when you actually put your experience to the ideas and you begin to ask yourself, how does it work here? And then in a real way, the fact that you're doing that with colleagues around the table and you're talking to each other. When you're talking to each other about your own practice of ministry, one of the things I'd like you to consider is you're actually teaching each other the practice of ministry. This is in fact what dialogue is all about. Some of this we're going to get into tomorrow, but dialogue is the way in which we learn the very task that God has given us. Dialogue is a learning conversation. One of the ways that it's been pointed out is that dialogue works because I say something, and then you respond, and in your response, I now understand that you didn't understand what I was trying to say. So I clarify. And when I clarify, now you understand that I didn't understand what you were trying to say. And the fact is that if you and I can stay in those conversations long enough, we will teach each other what neither of us was able to see. Friends, you will learn your practice talking to the people sitting next to you. And if all goes well, there'll be a few ideas tonight and tomorrow for you to talk about as you work your way through it. I am an older animal. I've come across some people tonight that I haven't seen for years. I am stunned by how old they got. It really was a remarkable kind of a thing. But I go back to a time in which things were quite different than what people are facing in ministry right now when I was starting out. I confess that my wife and I went to our 50th class reunion just a few weeks ago. And this is in Norristown High School, and so it was a Friday night deal, an all-day Saturday deal, and a Sunday morning breakfast. And part of the Saturday thing was everybody got on a school bus. Now, they chartered a school bus. When's the last time you rode a school bus? And if it's been a long time, do not sign up for it. It is not comfortable. So we drove around Norristown, and we were talking about this used to be there, that used to be there. Oh, something's missing. Oh, do you remember that? And it was a fun afternoon. And we drove by the United Methodist congregation that I grew up in. And when I was there, it had about 1,000 members. On the high holy days, our attendance probably was around 400, 500, something like that. And the high holy days, meaning when our organ director and our choir director had her extravaganzas with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Miss America used to come and sing. We did okay on Christmas and Easter, but those were the high holy days. 1,000 members then, 100 members now. And so it was one of the more disappointing parts of the trip. And as we went by, I could see that all of the shops and all the little restaurants in the neighborhood were Mexican, Middle Eastern, and African. And I thought, I know enough about that congregation to know that there's a number of things they didn't do. They didn't extend their hospitality beyond their own comfort level. They didn't pass leadership on to the next generation nearly quickly enough. They didn't reach out from the old norms and patterns and programs that they had. They kept them going even though nobody would come. And I thought to myself, in all of that, you know, none of that was criminal. It wasn't wise. But this was not a bad people. But the world around them changed. And the issue more than anything else, now when I'm saying that, the issue more than anything else, part of what I'm trying to say here too, is that when you get down to all those things that you know about church growth and hospitality and being able to extend across generations and that kind of business, for goodness sake, please pay attention. That is good, solid, technical work that if you and I don't do it, the congregation is not there to pass the faith on to the next generation. But I also know that if that's the only thing that you and I are working on, that we are in fact letting the culture pass us by. Because essentially one of the things that's driving what's happening in congregations today is at a significantly deeper cultural level that we could not compensate for if it's only around programs, if it's only around marketing, if it's only around signage. When I was saying that at an earlier time I came in, you know, as a pastor to a much different church in a much different culture, I came in at a time in which the culture pushed people toward the church. I keep saying that, you know, when I was first ordained as a pastor, you could not wake up in the morning and not have a church. Because people needed to know what church you went to, and you had to be able to point and say, that's my church. You didn't actually have to go there, but you had to be able to point there. Because it was a time in which people shaped and they framed their identity by where they belonged. And for me to be able to say that I went to that Methodist church instead of the Baptist church across the street not only gave me an identity, but it told the rest of the community where I fit in. It mattered where you belonged. And you shaped your identity because of that. And the world was busy trying to help you figure out what group you were a part of. Well, let's go back to my high school reunion for a minute. One of the things my wife and I discovered is that when we sat down 50 years later with all these people who graduated from the same school, we were meeting people for the first time. We knew who they were. You know, a couple of hints and a couple of old photos, we could even tell what they used to look like. But we were not part of their group because early on we chose courses that took you in that direction. They chose courses that took you in that direction. and we were separated into groups. It was a comfortable way of doing life. How are we doing? We okay so far? Yeah. Well, that comfortable way of doing life was just pushing people toward the church. People needed a place to be, they needed a place to belong, and it allowed folk to substitute membership for discipleship. Now, one of the things that I often come back to is that early on, one of the things that I was very clear about is that in my training, both in seminary and the early years of my ministry, I was never trained to make disciples. Now, the mission statement of the United Methodist Church is we make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I was never trained to make disciples. I was only trained to make members. Discipleship is when you change a person's life. I was never, ever expected to change a person's life, only to change their affiliation. It was a very different world because people were coming at us and all we had to do was receive. The world has changed. I hope you've noticed that. The culture no longer pushes people toward the church. It pushes people away from the church today. Identity is not shaped by what group you belong in, but by what you participate in. Now, one of the reasons why we're struggling so much with a lot of our metrics is we're continuously asked to count members, and members is a very insensitive way of figuring out who's part of your church because people don't join anymore, they participate. Right. People shape their identities individually, no longer as part of a group. My favorite example that I've used time and time again is how often have you been in a grocery store and have been going down the cereal aisle? Have you been there? This is a good place to say yes, Gil. Yes. All right. Now, when you're going down that aisle, how many different kinds of cereal can you choose from?
Too many.
Too many. And in fact, it's almost difficult to go down the aisle unless you know something about yourself. You don't need more information about cereal. What you need is information about yourself. You need to ask yourself, what do I need from a box of cereal? And you go through the list. Do I need something to help me with my cholesterol? Do I need fiber? Do I need color? Do I need noise when I pour the milk on in the morning? It is a world that encourages you to know yourself individually and trains you to know yourself individually. While quite often in the church, we're still simply asking people to be part of a group. People are coming to us with individual quests, and we're offering membership and formulas. The world is not pushing toward us, it's pushing away from us. There's a whole list of things that we could point to, including the fact that institutions are not trusted today. That's part of what we're dealing with. But also the fact that the margin of life, that discretionary life that's left over after you and I have already fulfilled all the commitments that we've taken on, whether it's work or family or other, full-time commitments, the margin of life that's left over is getting smaller and smaller. The discretionary part of life is getting smaller and smaller. And there are more and more voices of competition for that small margin that you and I are asking for. Right now, if you look at the Gallup and the Pew information, people will say that they are actively involved in a local church, and then sometimes the questions will go on and say, are you regularly active in the church? And right now, regular attendance in a congregation in the United States measures out at 2.1 Sundays per month. Now, when I was growing up, regular attendance was 4 Sundays a month. And for my grandparents, it was 8 Sundays a month. We're down to 2.1, and that's for the folk who are most deeply committed to our congregations. So where we used to do formation by membership, how do you even do formation in terms of a discipling lifestyle if in fact the folk are only with you for 2.1? Friends, we have shifted dramatically, and the world is not the same. Part of our problem is that we were once an established church. Did you all know that in the United States there is no established church? Okay, now if there is no established church, you who grew up Methodist or mainline Protestant in any form, do you know that you have always been part of the established church? That from the very beginning, the Protestant faith has been the established faith of this nation, even though legally we can't go down that road. But we have always been in the established position. I love pointing out that Look magazine and Life magazine, I think it was actually Look, that used to have an annual, there was an annual issue in which they identified the top 10 preachers in the United States. Is anybody old enough to remember that? I see you shouldn't have risked yourself and raised your hands. That was, yeah. 10. What's that? Yeah, right. Okay. You go ahead, play those little generational games. I know what you know. I know you know what I'm talking about. But if you think about it, I mean, they were all first of all, they were all white men over 65. 9 of them were Protestant. 1 was Roman Catholic. And that was because it helped subscriptions. And it was also because it was Bishop Fulton Sheen. But the established faith was the Protestant faith. Well, friends, where I want to go with this for the moment is that one of our dilemmas is that when you are the established faith, you don't need to know who you are or why you are. Right. Because everybody is busy trying to be like you. And everybody trying to be like you validates what you do, whether you know what it's about or not. Once the culture started to push people away from the church, we became disestablished. Now we suddenly needed a reason for people to be with us, and we didn't really have one, except that you could join if you wanted. And when you're disestablished, it's a terribly confusing time. It's a demoralizing time. When I was working with Alban, there was a period of about 2 years where I was doing long-distance consulting with the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. And they were trying to help their congregations revitalize themselves after apartheid. But now think about that. The Dutch Reformed Church was the established church. Everybody was trying to be like them as much as possible to get closer to the seat of power in that culture. After apartheid, they no longer held that position. So we were talking to the consultants, and we were talking about why is it so difficult to raise questions about vision? Why is it so difficult to raise questions of identity? And one of them came back and said, well, the reason it's so difficult is that we have never had to do it. We never had to ask ourselves who we were or why we are. And friends, I think Jack has said that you've all seen my latest book on Doing the Math of Ministry, which is all about metrics, and we're going to talk about particularly outcomes as we get into this. But one of the things that we're beginning to learn is that after we've learned all of that stuff about church growth, after we've learned all that stuff about hospitality, after we've learned all that stuff about reaching out into the community, if you do not have a sense of identity and purpose, it still doesn't matter. If you don't have a sense of identity or purpose, now think about, people who are down to a very thin margin of life of what's left over, and they have to make choices about how they're going to extend themselves and spend themselves. And even if they're thinking about going to church, how would they know to go to your church if you're not able to tell them who you are and why you are and what you're doing. The identity and the purpose is one of the key issues of living in this new culture. I'm not sure how far we'll get into it tomorrow, but one of the things that prompted the book was the discomfort that you and I have about metrics in the church. It started around 2008 when there was a major consultation in the United Methodist Church leading up to General Conference. The research was being done around 2010, but the report came in and it started the whole conversation about vital congregations. Have you been hearing about that? Oh, this is one of those little sidelights that I love. There is a measure of vital congregations that the general church can use, and now there is a report that goes out telling every annual conference the percentage of vital congregations that they have in their annual conference. We all right? The lowest percentage across all conferences was the conference that had 7% of their churches that were vital. Interesting. 2 years later, they took that same measure, and suddenly that conference had 22% of their congregations that were vital. Do you know how they did it? They changed their metrics. You know, if small groups are one of the things that we're having, and we had 5 small groups, but we look at our choir and they also have a quartet, ooh, there's 7 now. Which is fine, because suddenly we're now starting to pay attention to things a little bit better. But counting isn't enough. One of the things that happened was that as I was working with the bishops, particularly in the South Central jurisdiction, they were increasingly uncomfortable with metrics just as you and I are. And part of the reason for that is that the metrics that we have been using are remarkably insensitive. Membership at a time when people don't join, we talked about that. Average attendance at worship, when right now the North American standard is 2.1 instead of 4. Confessions of faith, when people come in different ways into the church. Baptisms, when adults or parents are now asking that their children be much more involved with their own decisions. These are insensitive measures. And quite frankly, quite often driven by demographics more than by anything that you or I could do about them. And so with the discomfort we've been having, we started off on this conversation about shouldn't we be able to be better at measuring ministry, including the non-quantifiable parts of ministry? Because much of what you and I do in ministry is not easily reduced to numbers. So we thought if we could at least begin to apply some of the strategies and some of the tools of social science that have been out there for a long time, wouldn't that help us as we moved along? Well, at Texas Methodist Foundation, we started a metrics project that lasted a little over 18 months, and we had a number of gatherings, some from people across the United States, and we tried to get deeper and deeper into this question. And the result was that there was one dominant learning. And that is that the question facing the church and its leaders today is not about metrics. It's about outcomes. We don't have outcomes. How do you measure whether or not you're getting someplace if you don't know where you're going? We fall into the same category as most nonprofits, and we will talk about this tomorrow. We are amazingly aspirational as a people. We want to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We allow that to hang out there so boldly that we never ask ourselves, what's the first step we need to take in order to be more disciple-like ourselves? Quite frankly, friends, having been a consultant in congregations, thousands of congregations over the past 35 years, I have been with a remarkable number of congregations that would like to make disciples without practicing discipleship. So if we're going to make disciples, and if we have a governing board that cannot go through a meeting without pointing fingers and calling names, isn't pure civility a step of discipleship?
Yes.
Okay, but you see, the fact is, friends, unless we start breaking things down to that, where we know what is the measure of change that we need to be able to address in order to be faithful on our path of making disciples and transforming the world, we can't get there. The issue facing our denomination and facing many of our congregations is getting clear about our identity and getting clear about our purpose. And it's not an easy task. Favorite question of mine is, how many of you think of yourself as younger than you actually are? Come on, friends, be bold now. Let me suggest that what that indicates is that you know more about who you were than you do know about who you are. And every once in a while, there's a muscle that reminds you of the difference. Fair enough? Overwhelmingly, the congregations that I have worked with have known much more about who they were than about who they are. Our United Methodist denomination knows much, much more about what it was than about what it's called to be. And so we are on that marvelous learning edge in which we are the people that will help others stand on our shoulders, just as we have stood on the shoulders of others. But the learning work is the hardest work. That's where you and I have to let go of the old things in order to pick up the new. We don't know who we are. We're not clear about why we are. There's a wonderful piece of research that has been actually replicated a couple of times that talks about church growth. Hartford Institute of Religion did this research a couple of times. Albany had a few forms of it ourselves while we were working with church growth issues. And one of the ways of sharing the results of the information would be to say, if you're asking a question, do conservative congregations grow? Theologically conservative congregations. Right now, we know very definitely that the answer is yes. If they are self-aware of their conservative theological position and they operate out of it. But we could also ask the question, do theologically liberal congregations grow? And the answer is yes, as long as they are self-aware of their theological position and operate out of it. We can ask the question, do evangelical congregations grow? The answer is yes, if they have that self-awareness and if they operate out of that identity and are purposeful about it. We can ask the question, do congregations with social justice identities grow? The answer is yes, if they have clarity about who they are and what they're doing. The only parts of the church that don't grow are those in the middle. Those who don't have a self. Those who don't have a purpose. When it comes right down to it, friends, if others are thinking about being part of a faith community and you would like them to be part of yours, how in the world could you expect them to choose to be with you if you don't know why you gather? Do you hear it? Now, there are so many things that we have to attend to along the way while we're doing this work, but I need to say, friends, this is the fundamental piece for me, that if we're not able to do this, then in fact, we probably have very little future. You all know that right now the projections for our United Methodist denomination is that we are going to lose about 33 to 35% of our congregations over the next 15 years. Of our 32,000 congregations, we have about 11,000 that are poised to die. They have slipped below the threshold of change. They no longer have enough purpose or energy to continue. We'll weather the storm. We'll weather the storm, and we will try to be as calm and gracious as we can to the people in those congregations. But friends, the real test will be for the remaining congregations in terms of whether they have clarity, whether they have purpose, whether or not there is a reason for them to be in this culture and for other people to be with them. We're going to talk about outcomes, and we're going to talk about leadership. Those are key items for me. Just as a final aside here, friends, I have been in love with this one piece of work that I encountered about 25 years ago from a fellow named Andrew Abbott talking about the systems or the system of professions. It's called An Essay on the Division of Expert Labor. And it's just delightful study about how all of the professions came to be and how they developed over centuries. And one of the things that he argues is that every single profession started as an answer to somebody's question. And so English law, for instance, started as an answer to questions about property rights. Who owns what? Well, we need a way to do that. And so we started to get some rules together, some laws together. Somebody had to own them, somebody had to care for them, and so suddenly law was there. Well, what about health and sickness? How does somebody deal with sickness? Well, medicine was there, and they had an answer for that. And so every single profession has its own answer, its own jurisdiction, if you will. Well, what happens as the professions go on is that the professions start to bump into each other and they argue over their boundaries. Who has the right answer? And so one of the classics that Abbott was paying attention to at one point was the question about alcoholism. What do you do with people who drink too much? Well, originally the church had the answer. You call them sinners and tell them to stop. And that's the only answer we had for a long period of time. But then suddenly law came along and said, no, actually we have a better answer. You put them in jail. Well, then social work came along and said, now wait a minute, before you just send all these people to jail, don't you understand that there's an environment involved, and that if you help these people control their environment and don't return them to that environment, you can address this issue as well, only to have psychology come along and say there is such a thing as an addicted personality. Do you hear what just happened? All these different professions kind of jumped into the boundary and said, we have an answer here. And they would often compete over having the right answer. Well, the reason I wanted to say that, friends, is that the culture has been competing for the church's boundaries. Those things that we assumed we always held are now deeply being competed for by others. I'm working on a project right now that has gotten me involved with quite a few people who are outside of what we would consider denominational expressions of Christianity. And there's two young people in particular that I have been fascinated by who are Harvard Divinity Schools. Each of them has a resume longer than my life could manage. They have already moved into so many different areas in ways that I don't even understand. Casper Turkile and Angie Thurston. And one of the things they've done is a study of organizations and groups in the United States that millennials are now going to answer their questions. And they've identified 6 themes. Now listen to the themes. They're basically saying that there are 6 recurring themes, they go on to say, often found in mission statements, in manifestos, on the lips of leaders and participants, because they best reveal the cultural DNA of what young people in the culture are looking for. The first is community. valuing and fostering deep relationships that center on service to others. The second is personal transformation, making a conscious and dedicated effort to develop one's own body, mind, and spirit. The third is social transformation, pursuing justice and beauty in the world through the creation of networks for good. The fourth is purpose finding, clarifying, articulating, and acting on one's personal mission in life. The fifth is creativity, allowing time and space to activate the imagination and engage in play. And the sixth is accountability, holding oneself and others responsible for working towards defining goals. Friends, is that not the way that you and I have been taught to think about congregations? Couldn't we have had a conversation only about congregations, only about the Church of Jesus Christ, and use these same descriptors? Except when Casper, except when Angie did this work. They did 10 case studies that talked about the lineage of the organizations that they were looking at, the progeny of these organizations that they were looking at, and almost never did they talk about a congregation. Young people are finding as many of these things in the spin class at the gym as can find it in our congregations. We have allowed ourselves to assume an identity and a purpose that was given to us from an earlier time. If we're going to talk about leadership, we really do need to talk about who are we now and why are we now. And we'll get started on that tomorrow. Friends, again, thanks for the invitation. Hope you have a good night. Jack's buying breakfast. And we'll see you in the morning.